Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar this afternoon. This is number 2 in the UX Byte series that we started just 2 weeks ago. And this webinar is about building user empathy and understanding. And it's really a next stage into looking at ways to work with users, and it's an essential part of a UX designer and researcher's toolkit. So myself and Marie-therese are going to take you through the next 30 minutes, and then we've got 15 minutes or so with questions and answers. So just by way of introductions, I'm Andrea. I'm a UX strategist at Fathom, part of the senior team. Been working with Fathom for around 5 years now. And I'll hand over to Marie-therese to introduce herself.
Hi everybody, I'm Marie-therese McCann, UX lead at Fathom. Also been at Fathom for just over 5 years now as well. And you can see my Twitter handle there is Busy Mummy, and I'd love to pick up any conversations maybe after today's webinar over at Twitter. Yeah.
Great. So just to cover, just to run through what we're going to cover in the webinar and the flow. So right now I'm going to walk you through the agenda, and there's a brief introduction that I'll lead before handing over to Marie-therese, who's going to go through much of the bulk of the theory and the practical application of empathy in UX design. So we'll start with what is empathy and its definition, what it is and what it isn't. We'll also talk about why empathy is important in the design process. We'll show you some empathy in practice. So the methods and the mindset that you can practice in terms of going through empathy processes in your projects. I'll then take over for a while to talk through a couple of examples of empathy at play when it comes to design, and hopefully leave you then with some ideas and thoughts around how you might start being a more empathetic professional in your either UX or design or business profession. And then we've got 15 minutes of questions and answers where hopefully we get those throughout the webinar. So it's worth noting that as we go through this, if there's any questions at all pop into your head, please put them in the Q&A box that you should see on your webinar screen. We aim to get to as many of those as we can in 15 minutes that we have at the end. But like last time, if you were able to join us last time, we promise to get back to the questions that we can answer and put those on the transcript blog article that we'll publish in about a week or so. So feel free to put up any question you like, no matter how trivial or no matter how detailed. We'll try our best to get to it one way or the other. Okay, so I'll kick off just with a brief introduction. So just to set the scene. So, user experience has a lot of definitions. If you just Google it, and if you work in UX, you've probably heard a dozen or more definitions of UX, and it does mean different things to different people. But at the heart of user experience design is user experience that someone has when they use a digital product. It's how it makes them feel. That's what really defines the user experience of that product. So if we're designing for how we want people to feel, surely we shouldn't be investing time in understanding them. So how do they feel now about either your existing product or service, your competitors? What type of person are they? What are their traits? What are their pain points? What are their current needs? What do they enjoy? Where do they spend their time? What devices do they use? The list goes on. But if we're going to design for people who have feelings and we want to influence those feelings so that they do something with our application or they feel better about our brand or service, we need to understand how they feel now when they're using our product and in the future, hopefully as well. So that's why empathy is such an important factor when it comes to UX and all forms of design. If we don't understand people, we won't be able to design for them. And this brings us back to something that was touched on in the last webinar. When we see data presented, when we see a survey, when we see click maps, when we see analytics dashboards like we have here, behind every data point, there is a human story. There's a complex individual with positive or negative aspects of how they're using your product, with a certain emotion that they're feeling at the time, with a certain context of use, that they have at that time using a certain device. So we need to try and understand these people at a deeper level than just a user who clicks on a screen and does something. We also looked at this last time if you joined webinar 1, but what you're looking at here is a research landscape, and the axes represent behavioral and attitudinal research methods on the left, and qualitative and quantitative along the bottom. And when we're talking about empathy and building empathy with people, we want to understand the who they are and why they do things, or why they perform certain actions. And that's why today's focus anyway is talking about empathy, and specifically when we're dealing with empathy, we're talking about research in that bottom left quadrant, where we're talking about what people, the real deep meaning behind people in the human stories, their attitudes and their behaviors, less about the numbers and the stats. So without knowing the why, future design decisions are a little blind and subjective. Without understanding the people intimately, can we really design for them from their perspective? This slide here, I guess, just shows that, you know, we're not all swimming in the same direction. So if we think about a theory that was defined in 1977, the false consensus effect, what that really is saying that most of us, unless we're scientists, we tend to perceive that, overestimate the perception that everyone is swimming in the same direction as us. Everyone is thinking like us and has the same values, judgments, perceived sense of reality. But in reality, it's very far removed from that fact. And in fact, as UX professionals and people that work in tech, we're even further removed from our users than most. And we touched on that in webinar 1 as well. So we really need to understand that we're not the user. Not everyone thinks and behaves like us. And that's why it's important to do lots of forms of research, but in particular, be empathetic to individuals, because they could be very, very different to how we believe things are. This is a chap called Frank Camaro, a New York guy, and works for a software company called Abstract. He's not particularly famous, but he has a great quote that I like, and I've used a few times just to really hit home the fact of design being for people, and it should be for people. So people ignore design that ignores people. So if you think your design processes to date have ignored people, don't be surprised that people might ignore that design. An important word there for me is people too, you know, over users. We often talk about users, but you know, if we think about them more as people or humans, that's really what empathy is all about. So MT is going to pick up the baton from now for a while.
Super. Thanks, Andrew. That was great. Okay, so let's get a little bit deeper into empathy, and we'll break it down into its fundamental principles. So as this graphic shows, empathy and sympathy often get confused, but they're vastly different. Sympathy is a shared feeling, usually of sorrow or pity for another person, and you're showing them concern for another person when you feel sympathy for them. Yet empathy, on the other hand, is stronger than sympathy. It means to be able to understand the point of view of others and imagine yourself in their place. So gaining empathy really enables you to put yourself in their position and feel, like Andrew was saying, really feel what they must be feeling and understanding their needs and wants. And importantly, this is really important, without them always expressing them explicitly to you. So in the world of design, you need to know what value and usefulness means for them without them telling you. Empathy is about listening, observing, noticing different patterns of behaviour and adapting to that. And it's really only then that you're empathising that you can really help and find useful solutions. So talking about empathy, it's really important to note that we can also break empathy down further, as there is 3 different types of empathy, which we'll look at now. So the first one there, cognitive empathy. It's about thought and logic as much as about emotion. So it's defined by knowing and understanding on an intellectual level. So this is in the same way that a doctor could look at a sick patient and try to understand the parts of the illness rather than dive into the patient's emotions. It's cognitive empathy, which responds to a problem with brain power. Then we have emotional empathy. And it involves directly feeling the emotions that another person is feeling, like crying at a wedding or cringing when someone's just about to stand on something sharp. It's really deep-seated, and it's like a gut reaction that often feels like a visceral human response that you can't help. And then there's compassionate empathy, which all of us as humans are usually striving for. And compassionate empathy really strikes this powerful balance between cognitive and emotional empathy. And because it considers both the feelings and the understanding of the logical situation that the other person finds themselves in, without losing your center in the middle of that. So it's like when your loved one comes to you in tears and you want to understand the logical reasons why they're so upset, while you also want to provide comfort to them by sharing in their experience and hopefully helping them feel better. Okay, so we know what empathy is, and that we are striving for in particular is compassionate empathy. So when you feel compassion, we're motivated to act. And this is the key that we're really looking for in UX, so that we can really connect and understand with our users' needs, so that we can act for them and create useful solutions that solve their real problems. As many of us on this webinar, like Andrew said earlier, are probably people that are creating technology products, which will reach the hands of many hundreds, thousands or more. Our designs wield an awful lot of power. So we need to make sure that our design process also considers our shared compassionate empathy for the diversity of people, the impact on the planet and society as a whole. And it's always really good to remember that just because we can do and make something doesn't mean we always should. If you're perhaps creating fictional personas and journey maps without listening to real people's experiences of a situation to understand their behaviour or challenges of a product or service, then you aren't hearing and understanding and feeling compassion. You're just creating a pretty poster that only will serve to gather dust. Empathy is really crucial to this human-centered design process, and empathy helps us as design thinkers to continually set aside our own assumptions and our bias about the world in order to keep the user's insight and their needs front and center of all of the work and the designs that we're doing. And we'll explore some of these methods in the next chapter of this webinar. So let's look at how we apply empathy in a human-centered design context. So we're using here IDEO's model of human-centered design. If we think about the design of a product or service, we're really concerned with understanding what do people desire, but also what is technically and organizationally feasible, while what is financially viable. So we're only achieving human-centered design when we create a product or service that sits comfortably in the midpoint of these three circles. And let's go back to what empathy means. So empathy means to be able to understand the point of view of others and imagine yourself in their place. It's the ability to connect with others based on understanding their needs and their wants and feelings without them expressing them explicitly. Yet a lot of bad design starts from neglecting the customer needs. But even more comes from failing to see the larger picture and one's place within it. So it's worth noting that empathy with users alone to make them feel good about an experience isn't always good design. So if it ignores the needs of employees and colleagues, it perhaps ignores some aspects of the business or causes internal disruption, then we'll have to ask ourselves, is it really good design? So human-centered design only works when we're in the midpoint of these three circles and the outcome of the product or service is working for all the people in this slide. And then let's go back to the fact that we're working with a myriad, a different combination or myriad of people. So developers will be working with developers. There might be some developers in this webinar today. We as UX professionals shouldn't assume that they know all the needs of the users. Yes, developers are extremely smart and they're highly IT literate. They're dealing with complex code every day, and they'll bring their own assumptions along too. Then there's your business and your organizational stakeholders. They're really important when it comes to defining the business goals, but yet, you know, they may have goals that are in opposition to the users as well. So it's really important to hear them, understand their purpose and their goals, and see, so that we can find a shared experience as UX professionals. We can create a shared experience that works for them and users, and it helps them achieve their goals. And then we most likely are always working with UI designers, and UI designers need to create useful, usable, desirable interfaces. And therefore our guidance, by the help of research artifacts, to allow them to create interfaces that serve a user's intent based on the user's mental model. So when we apply empathy, like we said earlier, the human-centered design means that we can create better experiences, and we know that better experiences drive commerce. So experiences that are desirable for users generate revenue, while also making sure that the solution is feasible and viable, so that we empower employees in the back end to provide that exemplar experience. It's important to note as well, this is a great body of research by PwC that stated that consumers are also willing to pay up to 16% for a better customer experience, as long as it goes beyond the norm and brings together the best elements of people, technology, and service with a smile. So we can do this with increased empathy throughout the design of our products and services. And we also need to remember that technology is only the enabler. It facilitates the connection between the product or service with customers and consumers, but we must gain and apply empathy to create these experiences that blend consumer demand for tech with their strong desire for authentic personal interaction. So this research was really strong on that. They're willing to pay more, up to 16% more, as long as it has all of those elements. Okay, so let's really dive into the practicalities then of being empathetic. It is about approaching your work with the right mindset combined with the right methods. And we're going to take a look at some examples of both in the next chapter here. Before we do that though, I'd like to set everybody in the webinar a challenge today and in the weeks ahead to just reevaluate if you're truly empathizing with in your own mindset and the methods that you use, to really ensure that bias and assumptions aren't misdirecting us. And it's also worth saying that some might feel that empathy has become a bit of a buzzword in design lately, but having empathy continually proves how really important it is, as we'll see later on in our case studies, and the impact that having empathy has had. Some research by William Hudson in 2009 also suggested that people working in the technology field, and more specifically males, have lower empathy. So if there is a disconnection between the designer and the user, the project won't progress smoothly, and it's a simple cause and effect relationship. Okay, so we're going to look firstly at our mindset, and our mindset is a set way of thinking with considered behaviours. So number one on the list there, as Emma stated in our previous UX Bytes webinar, do be aware of your innate biases and assumptions, because they're based on your situation and your lived experience and your personal motivations. You need to remember, like what Andrew described earlier as the false consensus effect, that all of us who are put into the position to guess how others behave will tend to overestimate how many other people share the same choices that we have made, the same values we have, or the same judgments that we would make, and keep that front and center. Number two there, listen to understand what the underlying motivation is. So not what you're hearing on the surface, but what's in underneath, what isn't being said explicitly. So you really have to listen hard. Observe the world through your users and your stakeholders' eyes. Understand their mental models. You need to ask yourself, does this serve a diverse set of needs? Does the environment and society need more of this? Investigate then, and really only then, is there technology that will enable us to meet those needs that we've identified and empathise with? And then finally, during design, you must live in your user's shoes. So throughout the design process, you're continually living and looking through the lens of your users and your stakeholders and the employees of that product or service, so you can understand it from their perspective, everything that you're designing. Okay, so that was looking at our mindset. And now we'll look at some of the methods, of which there are many that we could talk about today that help us gain empathy, but we've selected a few to discuss a little bit further. So method 1, listening sessions, and we've started with the most important method that requires a really key skill that you have to use throughout any of our methods to gain empathy. So at the heart of gaining empathy is great active listening skills. Listening sessions in particular consist of asking one main open-ended question. For instance, tell me about the last time you bought car insurance, and you let the person start from there. So you have to start by really listening to what that other person is saying and reflect on how they are feeling. And listening exercises, importantly, are not interviews. You're not trying to you are trying to understand the reasoning and their thoughts under the surface of what they're saying. We don't want to interrupt to ask about a solution. We don't want to let our mind wander with how we might be able to help, and we go off on a bit of a tangent. We have to listen. We have to withhold our judgment. We have to clarify if we feel we want to ask a question, to clarify what we've heard, to feel and also to feel what the underlying motivation is that is driving this user's thinking and actions. So no notes, no analysis, no problem solving, just deep pursuit of topics. Method 2, observation. Observing users interacting with a product or service or a number of connected services can be a really great way to understand and gain emotional empathy for their needs in a certain situation, and whether a current design is providing a logical way to achieve that goal. This example is natural observation and involves studying a user in the wild and tends to be less structured. This means spending time with a user or group of users and noticing patterns in their behaviour with the product or service, or the combination of services that they have to use in a day-to-day life. Method 3, understanding users' mental models. It's a brilliant way to learn what users believe are the building blocks and or the reasons of how or why a product or service currently works like it does. And you can do this in a number of ways. You can see here that we created a focus group sort of workshop environment to learn more about young people's cognitive thoughts and feelings about a particular topic. Mental models are built in a user's brain, and they are based on what we know from past interactions with anything in the world. But in technology, we're thinking past interactions with websites, of apps on mobile phones, or other digital products and services. Method 4 there, contextual inquiries, helps build compassionate empathy when you spend time with a user or group of users and observe their behaviour with a specific product or service. In this case, in a busy office environment where particular tools and processes are used daily by employees to make this service work. And finally, we've used participatory design sprints as a great method. And it's an approach which actively involves users and stakeholders throughout the design process. And this is really powerful as it helps ensure that we can have their needs and behaviours in the room at every step of the way throughout design, which keeps topping up our compassionate empathy levels throughout the design process. As was discussed earlier, and Andrew highlighted in the landscape of user research methods, you really must focus your mindset first and use these methods to help you gain that empathy, I guess, so that you can understand the who and the why. It's really important that we're walking in our users' shoes as we get rid of our assumptions, and we really listen and observe behaviours so that we cognitively understand how all the users and stakeholders logically process information. Without knowing why, our future design decisions are subjective to our beliefs and experiences. So I'm hoping that was helpful. I'm now going to hand back over to Andrew, who's going to take us through some real life examples and show the impact when true compassionate empathy is applied throughout the design process.
Thanks very much, MT. Yeah, so we've got 5 minutes to go, which means we're doing okay for time. So I just want to explore a couple examples with you and talk you through I guess quite contrasting examples. One where I feel that the design that's at play might not be showing too much empathy in the case of the actual service users. And then one where I think empathy is at the heart of why it was a successful initiative. So the first one I just want to talk about before getting into the main case study is airport security. You know, we've all done it, some more than others if we're frequent flyers. And you know, when was the last time any of us ever thought, you know, that was a great time going through security. You know, I really enjoyed queuing up. I didn't at all feel violated when people decided to frisk me. I didn't feel rushed when I was putting my bags on the carousel. I had loads of time to put my belt on before being ushered away by other passengers, and you know, things like that, or things like, you know, whenever I had to get my case opened up and the security person was going through my underwear. You know, none of us really remember airport security as a good experience. Of course, it's designed. It's not there by accident. It's probably, though, too weighted in terms of empathy towards the airport and the airline and potentially the security staff. What's the key ingredient missing there? It's probably that the passengers and their stories and their needs and their emotions, perhaps they're nervous flyers, and everyone's emotional typically at an airport. So it's important that experiences are designed around those emotions to help them, and perhaps not make them worse if they're negative. So I feel in this example, the airport security of the future, I hope, has more empathy at the heart of travelers. The next example is a case study that we at Fathom have cited a number of times, and it's really it's a really great case study because it brings together a range of stakeholders where empathy was at the center, and you have real valuable results, tangible results that you can stand over in terms of it being successful because that empathy was at the heart of the project. So back before this project, up until the point of 2012, violence and aggression in frontline hospitals in the NHS was costing over 69 million a year. If you think about absence, loss of productivity, security. And there were over 60,000 physical assaults in English NHS hospitals each year. And that continued to rise up until this initiative in 2012 started. So with over 21 million patients attending A&E every year, there's constantly going to be pressure in A&E to deal with those negative experiences and the high pressure and the frustration that comes with that. So A&E commissioned work through the Design Council, and they, you know, they went about a real due diligence process to try and understand and unearth the feelings and the people behind these experiences. So in order for the Design Council to understand what was going on, they really went deep in terms of ethnographic research. So they spent a lot of time interviewing, observing people using the accident and emergency rooms. They also worked with experts in staff in terms of the trusts, the emergency care specialists, and organizational consultants. And they really wanted to get to the heart of what were the issues faced by these frontline staff. So the patient journeys were mapped after all that observation. They were mapped against incidents of violence and aggression. And together, all those insights were analysed to understand why patients become aggressive and what type of patients become more aggressive than others. And in response to that, then they were able to come up with a three-pronged approach to improve the experience of both patients and staff. So we had the guidance solution. That was about information around waiting times, treatment processes, signage, patient leaflets, and digital platforms, some of which you can see on screen. There was the people solution. So that was the program of reflective practice designed to better support the NHS staff to manage and learn from violence and aggression. And then there was the toolkit, a package of information guidance for all sorts of staff, from managers, clinicians to healthcare planners, just to better develop a better service and risk identification and management portfolio. And just some of the results that came out of that, we can see that when they followed up on the design, that 88% of patients felt the guidance clarified the process better. 75% said the improved signage reduced frustration. So there's just a design, the impact of design right there. Just good design signage can reduce frustration. For those looking at return on investment from the commercial side, for every £1 spent, £3 is generated in benefits, largely down to savings on the cost of security and repairs. 50% down was the threatening body language and aggressive behaviour, and also patients' complaints relating to information communication fell dramatically too. So a really great case study, and I'd recommend actually just you guys looking into that one a bit further. There's lots of information online about the Design Council's work with accident and emergency in England. So we're just about to dip into Q&A. I'm just going to finish with one quick slide. This is about if you're, no matter where you are in your journey with UX design or research, if you're not practicing some of the skills that MT went through, where do you start? What's the best place to start thinking about being a more empathetic designer or researcher? So I'm just going to leave you these 7 points. Try and learn to become a really good listener. Develop your ability to observe and see what's going on around you. Ask people for input. So those are people who are not connected with you. Ask them for their opinion and insight. The more you can get a rounded view from other people who don't share your false consensus, as I said before at the start of the slide deck, the better you'll be at understanding other people's needs. Be mindful of your own attitude, so don't go in knowing, pretending and suggesting you know the answers when you're trying to find out things from people, because that will go down poorly in the research. Always be aware of your biases that MT talked about. Go in with a humble approach and adopt that humility. And probably the most important message is get out of the office, the boardroom, or like most of us now, probably the house, and see what's going on around the world around you. And if regard to your digital product or service, if you're not the person who is out there on the front line seeing what's going on, now is maybe the chance to do that if empathy is one of the things you want to develop. So thank you. We're going to dip into questions and answers now. I've seen a few have popped in, so thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. That was great. So yeah, thanks for everybody. You're firing away with the questions there. I was just taking a quick scan through to see what we'll head up with first. I think in the chat, even just to get us going, there's a good question about some good resources or videos or books that we'd recommend. Now we have a brilliant book that we all lean on in Fathom called Practical Empathy by N.D. Young. Is a fantastic resource to lean on. It's by Rosenfield Media, and yeah, you get all the methods and the mindset, with case studies and just practical information to lean on there with that. So it's a really good one. I have a question here for you, Andrew. If you have limited budget, what method would you recommend perhaps to get best value?
Yeah, I think just before answering that with one method, I think the most important thing to state is that when we're thinking about user research in particular and understanding people as rounded individuals, I think it's always good to look at what people say and what people do. So if we remember the research landscape, the behavioral and the attitudinal, I think that if you're getting opinion and you're getting what people's thoughts are, it's always really useful to try and get some kind of observation or test to actually backed up is what they say, what they actually do. So what they say or they think, is that actually what they do? So to think about some of the methods to answer that question specifically, a pretty low cost method might be just an interview, to try and get some time with one of your key user types or personas, and then you might want to merge that in with some kind of test or observation of that individual as well, so that you can gauge is what they say and think actually reflected in what they do. And very often when we run usability studies, we're trying to get a bit of both. We're trying to understand the individual through conversation before testing an interface or testing a service, so that we can get a bit of both. And that's, if you're on a tight budget, I'd recommend maybe trying to think about a session like that. So you're not having to split up observational sessions and attitudinal research sessions.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. I think there's a good question here. What if you don't possess natural empathy and humility? You know, Andrew and I were talking about this when we were just putting together you know, all our resources for the webinar today. And you know, as a UX professional, it's so important, and I hope with all of the detail that Andrew and I have just went through there today, you know, we've shown that, and how powerful it is in the case studies when we get it right and we truly are empathetic, and it is that compassionate empathy that we're looking for. But at the same time, it is something that we need to practice, and some of us are better at it than others, and we can practice it and strengthen it like any muscle. It does take practice, and you know, that's why we focus particularly on getting the mindset with the methods together, right? So you could have the best process and the best methods and the best access to people and the right people that you need to talk to for a new digital product or service. But if you haven't got the right mindset, and you can practice and train that mindset and get better at it over time, and you know, just brushing up on those active listening skills, it isn't easy. But it is about being aware about how important that is. So you know, just practice it at home, even when you're talking to your family, and you probably do it without thinking, but really consciously thinking about active listening. You know, what are you hearing on the surface, but what's the underlying motivations and feelings that is underpinning what you're hearing? And that's when you're really being compassionate, and you're listening for the logic and the thought process that the user is talking about, but you're also trying to gain an understanding for their feelings and emotions in the midst of that as well. So yeah, it can be trained, just like any sport or playing music or being a baker. You get better at it over time. You know, equip yourself with good resources like the likes of that book that I mentioned, and just keep working at it. So it is so powerful. Okay, we have another question here. Andrew, I think maybe I'll pass it over to you. How would you overcome if a stakeholder perhaps is dubious about the benefit of research to gain empathy for users?
Yeah, it's not an uncommon challenge, that. I think that if your stakeholder is somebody who perhaps isn't involved in the design team, it's often difficult to rationalize some of the things that you do in the detail of a design process. But what I would say about the empathy piece is try and find evidence at the earliest opportunity of people having problems. So and try and make that as raw and as real as possible, not your curation of it. So things like usability tests or audio recordings of interviews can be very effective, because the emotion and the frustration often comes across really clearly. So if you've done a survey, for example, and gave it to a stakeholder who was dubious about empathy, and it said that 5 out of 10 people had a problem with a particular form on a website, that might not make that person that empathetic towards users. They might just think, oh, well, we need to improve the form. But if you show them 5 people tearing their hair out, or people of different languages, or people who don't have a particular device trying to use that, and seeing the frustration on their face, and seeing their sentiment towards the organization, that might make them then decide that empathy is important and users are important to this whole design process. So I would say think about any opportunity to either put them in front of the customer or the user, or bring evidence of the customer or user particularly having difficulty or showing negative emotions towards them or their product. We've seen it, until we'll back this one up, we've seen it dozens of times where we've presented to people not involved in the project, and they want to then know more because we've showed them that sort of evidence. to wet their whistle.
Andrew, thanks. We have more of a housekeeping question there. Is it possible just to access the recording from the previous webinar? And yes, we put the link in the chat earlier, but we can also email it out to all the attendees later after this as well. But you can find the link to the last webinar on our blog at fathom.pro. And we'll be putting the link up to this webinar this week as well, alongside the transcript too. And for all of the questions that we don't manage to get to just over the last couple of minutes, we'll also put all of the questions on that blog post and answer each of them there as well. So please do follow up at our blog. So another question here is, how do you ensure that everybody on the team gains empathy to create a successful product and or service throughout the design process? So this is another good question too, and would love to have went into it today, but we've planned in our webinar series to dive a little bit deeper into the tools that make their way out of the methods of gaining empathy. So things like empathy maps and personas and user journey maps and all of the different tools which we refer to as artifacts that come out of the methods that are so powerful, and really what and why we use them and how we use them. And we will put dedicate a webinar to looking into that a lot more deeply. But it's using those tools throughout the design process that is really, really important. That's what they're for. No client comes to any of us asking, make me a persona. A persona or an empathy map or a journey map is only a tool to help you design better and to help everybody on the team continue to have the empathy that you have heard in your user research. Keep that empathy front and center during the design process. So it is difficult, and like we said earlier, it is very important in IDEO's human-centered design process map with the 3 circles overlapping. We do need to ensure that we make something first and foremost that is desirable for users, but it has to also be equally feasible internally and for employees that will drive the experience, and viable for the organization to make money from it, to run it successfully, whatever that product or service is. So it's important that we as UX professionals gain the empathy initially with all of those people, summarize it in really useful, strong, clear artifacts, and use those artifacts throughout the design. And everyone involved, everyone that we've just mentioned is involved and should be involved in that design process. So yeah, we'll pick up on that question again at a future webinar and just get into more detail to flesh that out. So I think yeah, sorry.
Yeah, we're just about up for time on the questions, but it's great to see so many come in, and we will make a real effort to try and respond to all that we can through the transcript form. So look out for an email coming your way, posting you to content that will summarize the webinar and give you some answers to those questions as well. So just before we do wrap up, I want to first of all obviously thank everyone for coming along today over your lunch break. Really, really appreciate the attendance at both webinars we've run so far. It's been great. And please do stay in touch with us. You can subscribe to our newsletter at fathom.pro for more of this type of insight and some blog articles, and also just to know a little bit more about our agency. You can follow us on Twitter, myself and MT as well on Twitter. We'd love to hear from you. You can follow us on LinkedIn, where you'll mostly see our blog content as well. And with a YouTube channel where, amongst other things, these webinars will be posted. So look out for the recording, and maybe if you enjoyed it, maybe you'd share it with 1 or 2 others. So thanks everyone. Thanks for coming along. Really enjoyed presenting for you today. Thanks for the questions and engagement, and hope to see you soon.